1 second. I'm making sure that we're actually recording. Good. Okay. So today's our final day of classes. So a few announcements. There is no final exam in the course. Your final grade is dependent on the web project. And as you can see, that's due Thursday at 6 a.m. And I have to hold abbreviated office hours today because I got an appointment at 3:15. So I'm going to have to terminate office hours around 2:50 today. So really only going to be able to hold them briefly today. However, just like I did last night, I'm planning to try to hold some impromptu office hours late this evening. So I will announce it when I come online. I can't quite know what exactly my evening schedule is, but my guess is that I'll be coming online probably sometime between 8:30 and 9:30, and I'll be holding office hours in for about an hour during that time. So, and I'll make announcements like I did through Canvas. So you can feel free to ask questions then. So that's tonight. And then tomorrow, I plan to hold office hours from 11 a.m. to noon, for those of you who would like some help. And again, I might be able to hold some impromptu office hours tomorrow night as well. I'll just have to see. That's a little far in advance right now. I had a good question about some of you have not yet received feedback for Web Project 2, and you can't be expected to correct your mistakes on Web Project 2 with appearance and layout. You don't have feedback. So you haven't received feedback by Sunday. I'm going to instruct the TAs not to deduct points for the same appearance and layout problems twice. Now, I did publish a grading guide, okay? And I do expect you to go through it, and I specifically did note a bunch of things that were common mistakes from the last time I taught the course. So I am going to hold you responsible for this because I'm telling you very specifically, make sure that this is a checkbox of things you need to make sure that your layout and appearance match, okay? And then I've given you interaction with the website. By the way, you see it looks like it's 300 points, but actually that's just to make the TA's life easier. So they're actually going to divide the student score by 3. So even though it looks like it's out of 300 points, it's really out of 100. And then I've given you a checklist of operations that the TAs are going to be performing and what their point values are. So that is a very useful tool you should be employing. And if you have limited time, you can see what things are worth the most points. So that is here, grading guide associated with Web Project 4. And just a few things to help you with that further. So the interactions that you'll have a login interaction where you enter something and then press a button. And this is going to, when you hit login, that is going to generate a AJAX server request. And if it succeeds in matching the instructor's email and password, then there should be a redirect to your apr27.php page. Otherwise, you want to display a message down here indicating it's invalid. Then on the apr.php page, when the user clicks or selects a new section, that again is going to lead to an AJAX request. And my recommendation is that on the server side, you create an entirely new page at this point, because essentially everything has to be replaced. I know that some of the boxes, like the number widgets, could stay, but it's just probably easier to recreate the entire page from scratch when you select a new section. And again, you will take the first outcome from that section as the default. The third interaction you can have is when you click on one of these outcomes. And again, what I recommend is you completely reconstruct the page on the server side. And I told you in the web write-up, I implemented these as links. So that made it very easy. It simply called the script with the appropriate link or outcome ID, and the PHP script just constructed the entire page. Then you have your save button, save results, save assessments, save narrative. And those are each going to be a sending data to form data to the server, and you're going to be updating the database on the server side and then sending back an indication of whether the save succeeded or failed, basically true, false. And you'll be displaying a message invisible here, but you can see it in the video, indicating whether the result succeeded or failed. And that will be part of the callback function for that AJAX request. Then when another interaction with the browser right here, plus new, this is strictly a client-side interaction. When you hit the new button, there will be no AJAX request. So this is the one place where you do not have a AJAX request. So when you hit the new button, this is completely handled client side by adding a new row to the table. So all you're doing is appending a new row. I implemented it as a table. You can implement it any way you want, but my plus new button modified the DOM by adding a new row to the table. Then when you click the trash can, it's optional whether you make an AJAX request or not. So you are allowed, okay, so here you're allowed to use an AJAX request. To immediately delete the item from assessments. But you will also, I don't want you reconstructing the page. You should just modify the DOM by deleting the row. So no matter what, I don't want you reconstructing the page. Now, if you have, you have. I don't want you to go back and redo it. But the efficient thing to do is to simply delete the appropriate row from the HTML DOM. And you don't have to use an AJAX request here. You could wait until the user presses save assessments and then in some way transmit information to the server indicating which IDs, assessment IDs, need to be deleted as part of this save. So I don't care whether you do the deletion immediately when the trash can is pressed or whether you defer it until save assessments. And then, and that takes care of all the interactions. That's not quite true. The last interaction is if they click on this person icon, there should be a drop-down menu allowing them to reset the password. And this page should pop up and allow them to change the password. And when they hit submit, that will also be an AJAX request, provided that the new password and the confirmed password match. And then you'll make a AJAX request and update the database. And with the return value, again, you indicate whether that succeeded or failed with a message. So those are your interactions with AJAX. So the submit button on the password page, the save buttons on the forms, on the 3-section forms, possibly an interaction with the server when you hit this any of the trash can buttons. Then whenever you select a new section or a new outcome, those are interactions with the server. Okay, so questions about that? Okay, and then
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about that total value there.
Yes.
Is that supposed to be from the database, a total number of people
No.
in the class, or is it
No,
just added up?
yeah, you should add it up. So every time you enter a number widget, that's a good point. Anytime you enter a number widget, this total field should be updated. So that's a great question. So in fact, another interaction is right here when any of these 3 fields are updated, it'll simply be a client side update to the total field. So good, excellent point. When you do any of those, you have to do a check, or not a check, you have to update the total field. Other questions or comments? Okay. One thing, I know I went through it quickly on Thursday at the end of class, so I actually added a slide. Saying exactly what happens when you have a get or post request. So there's 4 parameters to a get or post request in jQuery. So this is in jQuery. So the method calls are either get or post. So the first argument is a string. It's the URL for the server-side script, and you can use, you don't need a full URL. You can use it relative to the existing directory. So for example, if you have a PH, is this going to let me do it? Doesn't look like it's just may not let me do it. Nope. Okay. Oh my goodness. Doing the right order. Okay. So for example, if you had something stored in the PHP directory, then you could say PHP / say abet.php. And that would get the appropriate, it would expect a PHP directory in the directory that served the HTML page, and then it would go to abet.php. So the URL is allowed to be a relative directory path, just like it is in Unix. Then the second argument is the data to be sent to the server in the form of a dictionary that can be encoded using JSON. So it's basically a JavaScript object. And the key value pairs that you transmit will be available in either the $_get or $_post, whichever one you happen to, whichever method you're using. The third argument is a callback function that you can call when the server returns its response, and it takes a single argument, which is the server's response. And generally, you're going to be using JSON as the response type. So that argument is generally going to be a JavaScript dictionary. And you can get at it using key value pairs. Now, if you're coming back from a PHP call, most likely it's going to be a list of objects. One object for each row is the probable way that. So you'd probably iterate through the array, and for each object which corresponds to a row, you would extract the information you need. Now, that's certainly going to be the case for the assessment plans. For some of the other, and for like, but sometimes it may just be an array, like for outcome IDs, it might just be an array. So but you should know what, you'll know based on how you encoded it on the PHP side. And then finally, the fourth argument, a string that tells the browser how to parse the server's response, and typically that will be JSON. Okay. And then a final trick that I employed, so just to show you, sometimes the problem with only one argument being allowed to the callback function. So the callback function can take only one argument, which is the server's response, and that can be a little bit constraining. In my color ballot example, the way I handled that issue, when I wanted more than one argument to the callback function, is that when I made the call to Ajax, I provided an anonymous one argument function, and then I just had that call the quote real callback function and included any additional parameters that I wanted that callback function to have. So if you would like in jQuery for your callback functions to have additional arguments, this is an easy way to make it happen. Just provide kind of like a stub for the callback function and have that stub call your real callback function with the arguments that you actually want it to take. Questions about any of that? Okay. So in that case, we're going to switch gears completely for the remaining 50 minutes or so. And we're going to talk about a completely different way of constructing a so-called full stack web interface. So what we did throughout the second half of the semester is we had a JavaScript front end and a PHP backend. And a lot of people don't like that because they have to learn 2 languages. And therefore, some clever person figured out how to use JavaScript on the server side, which probably wasn't all that hard. You just had to overcome the inability to access files. And I think generally that's these days just a permission issues, and build some interfaces to databases so that JavaScript could operate with databases. So once that was done, it was now possible to execute JavaScript on the back end. And the name of the, I guess, framework or package that allows you to do it is called node.js. So it's an alternative way of developing an application that does not use PHP and that uses JavaScript on both the server side and the client side. So it has kind of the same ideas, which is that on the client side, you typically have what are called, well, they're on the server side, but you have what are called view templates. And these render into HTML. So it's not really all that different in concept from the PHP HTML template. So a PHP file is essentially also a view template that renders into HTML. So that's still present in most Node.js applications or frameworks provide view templates. The book talked about one that's called Pug, but there's others available, I think ESJ or EJS, one or the other. There's multiple view template libraries out there. Then on the server side, you can call different routines effect or functions using what are called routes. And these basically look like directory things that start with a slash, and then they give often the name of a function that's going to get called, like say user list. And on the server side, you have a basically a single threaded app. The server is simply sitting there in a big event loop. So basically it's sitting in a big event loop and it's accepting, so the server is accepting client requests. Calling the appropriate function and returning results. Now, I am not a Node.js expert, but my understanding of it is it operates a lot like the talk server in JTalk that you've done in either 360 or 365. So essentially, the server is sitting there listening on a port, and it's in a pretty tight loop, accepting client connections and requests from clients. So you can't have that server thread doing a lot of computation, because while it's doing that computation, it can't accept any other client requests. So normally what's happening is it's sending, most of the server-side requests are just database requests. So most server-side activity is in the database. And the database itself is multi-threaded and is quite capable of handling concurrent transactions. So basically, while Node.js is a single thread spinning and accepting requests and then calling functions, these functions normally are just connecting to the database, and the database itself is multi-threaded and therefore can handle multiple requests at the same time. So a Node.js application is basically relying on the fact that most of the server-side activity is going to be in the database. If you have to do a fair amount of additional computation on the server side, then you probably don't want to be using Node.js. So for example, if you have some kind of sophisticated graphics rendering engine that is rendering graphics and then sending those graphics to the client, probably Node.js isn't the way to go, because you can't have that kind of computation going on in that thread, that single thread that's accepting all these requests. Now, I've seen indications that Node.js can be multi-threaded, but I must admit I'm not experienced enough using Node.js to know how one might be able to potentially use that to do heavier computation. I do know that that pretty much without exception, the articles I read say, if you're doing a lot of computation on the server side, don't use Node.js. Use a different language like PHP, Java, C#, Python, Perl instead. So that's the basic idea. A tight loop running on the server, accepting client requests, making calls to a database, and then sending the results back. So the JavaScript on the server side is essentially just a quick connection to the database. And I think the easiest way to kind of show what's going on is to show you a simple tutorial that I've had people work through in the past, but there wasn't going to be, it doesn't work well in a remote setting. It's too hard to help everyone. So what I'm going to show you is a sample Node.js application that basically allows you to add new users to a mailing list and then display those users as a list and send a mail message to them. So what it will illustrate is the use of routes. It will illustrate, in this case, it's using ESJ or EJS. I think it's EJS. How you can render a view template using it, and a couple other things. Okay, so if you're interested, this is the link here, a simple Node.js tutorial. It really is dead simple, but the issue is you may run into some issues if you're running Linux. First of all, it's not quite as easy to apparently run Node.js with Linux, and there can even be some issues with Windows and Macs. At any rate, this particular application is going to be generating a list of, go down to the end, down to the punchline. There we go. Whoops. Wow. Didn't realize how far I had to get. There we go. So we want to be able to read from the database a bunch of users And by clicking on any of the users, send a mail message. And the second thing we're going to want to do is be able to add a new user to the database. So it's going to be pretty simple stuff. The backend database is going to be MongoDB. And all that we're going to be storing in that database is a username and an email. So we have a collection of documents with the username, an email, and an automatically generated ID. So let me get to it first. So when you create an Express, so we're using Express here as the framework. So just like with JavaScript, using the base node.js package is way too difficult. It's like, to me, actually almost more like machine language programming. It's so low level. So you typically use some framework to add syntactic sugar to make it a lot easier to perform functions. So the book and this tutorial both use the Express framework to interact with the lower levels of node.js. So essentially what happened at the very beginning is that we created an Express project and we called it Node Test 1. Okay, so I'm not going to show you how to do that. The tutorial does. But when you create an Express project, you get a directory that contains a bin module and a directory with the routes that will go to the server, a directory with views that are your view templates, and a file called package.json with all your dependencies. So you can see here that some of the packages we're using is EJS, that's the template package for views. We're using Express, this version. We're using MongoDB, and we're using Monk rather than Mongoose as our interface to the MongoDB. So this gives us our set of dependencies, and you'll see this is a script that's going to get executed when we start up our server. And then node modules contains all the modules that are required to support those dependencies that you saw in package.json. So there is a way to install these modules. So you can see here, npm is the installer for the node.js. It installs packages onto your computer in either a global directory, which is going on here with the -G, or locally in your directory. So the this package.json helps Express know what it needs to download into this node modules directory. Okay, then if we go to views, you can see that we have a bunch of different templates, and the two that we're concerned with is our user list view and our new user view. This one is the one that displays the list of users. This one displays the new users. So if we look at userlist.js, you can see that it looks like an HTML page. and that it has code islands, just like PHP has code islands. So in this case, the code islands are JavaScript code islands, and they are encased in this less than % sign. And you can see that what it is doing is it is creating a string with a series of line items, markup things with a mail to. That's what's going to allow the mailer to come up when you click on it. And then these are coming in, we'll see, from a dictionary that is returned from the server. So the server, when it comes back, the callback function is going to be providing us with this array called user list, which contains the email and usernames. So you can see this is a lot like PHP. The only difference is that the code islands are JavaScript rather than PHP. And then down here, you can see the second code island with the minus sign says basically interpolate whatever is in this variable, include it in the HTML page. So after constructing the list variable here, we interpolate it, that list string, into the HTML right here. And again, it's just a series of line items. We look at new user.ejs. We see that's just a simple form. Again, a couple code islands right here. The title is coming in. There's, again, we're getting some, you'll see information from the server that tells us what the value of this title is. And here you can see a route. So when the form is submitted, the route is add user. Okay? It's basically just like a, well, we'll get to it. So it's just for the time being, that's what a route looks like. But kind of like it's going to be translated eventually into a call on the server side. Okay, and then everything else is pretty much as you would expect. So it's just this interpolation here of the title, and here is a route that is getting called when the form is submitted. Now let's look at the routes. So at the beginning, it's basically it's requiring a module express, and from express it's getting this router module that's going to be the module that's able to route things to the server. And you can see here, this is the route that creates that user list view. So this will execute on the server side. And this is a function. It takes a request object, produces a result object. So this is the input, this is the output. So the first thing we do is we have a pointer to the database object, basically a connection object from the request object, and we're using a MongoDB backend. So the documents are stored in user collection, and you can see this again is executing on the server side, this particular function. And once it has a reference to the collection, it does a find, and you can see it's an unconditional find. And when the find returns the callback function, you can see it has the return objects in docs. Now remember, MongoDB is already a JSON collection. So everything that comes back from the database is already in the form of JSON. So it's very easy to transmit this JSON to the client. And now you can see here is where we render the view. So it's saying we're rendering this user list view. So this again is going on. Actually, someone may have to help me with this. I'm not sure if this one goes on the client side or the server side. I know that the views start on the server side, but I'm not sure whether this rendering is being done server side or client side. At any
It
rate,
depends on how things are set up, but it's probably happening on the server side, but depending on your framework and configuration and all sorts of stuff, it could be happening in one or the other or both.
okay, thank you. So there you go. It can happen. It depends on basically how the configuration has been set up. So it seems like normally it's done server side, but it could be done client side, or it could be a mix of the two. So we won't worry about that. We'll just, but what this is saying is go to the views directory, find the user list file, and pass to it this dictionary. So remember that user list accessed that dictionary called user list, and that's where it's getting it from. And you'll see that the user list variable is given docs. Okay, and that is the extent of what's happening. So you can see it's basically just get some information from the database and then render the resulting database information into a view page. Okay. And when we first wanted to render a new user page, you can see that was very easy. Render, name of the page, and here was that title. Remember, we were interpolating title. That was coming from the data being passed to the render function. Okay, and then here's the command on the server side to handle the submission when we add user. So in this case, what we want to do is first obtain the new name and new user email. And that is coming from the request.body. And remember, we look at the view. Name was username, name was user email. So that is where it is getting those names from. So again, there's middleware that is basically bundling up that form data and putting it into the request object for us, and in particular in this body object, so that we can access the form data. Again, we get our user collection and we do an insert that looks a lot like the insert you see with MongoDB. And we get, again, a function that allows us to do something, a callback function that we can execute when that operation completed. In this case, all we care about, we're just doing an insert. So we're not, this doc object would have any items that we had selected from the database, but in this case, we don't care because we're doing an insert. All we care about is actually the error object. If for some reason there was an error and it failed, we do this send, where we render a HTML page that says there was a problem adding the information to the database. And as far as I can tell, this is a lot like document.write with JavaScript. It seems like it just overwrites whatever content used to be on that HTML page. So it's pretty destructive. And of course, this was just a very simple tutorial. It wasn't trying to do anything sophisticated. So if there was a failure, basically just wiped out the web page and wrote that message to it. Okay, otherwise, so you can see if it's not an error, otherwise we redirect to the user list view. Okay, so user list, this will call the user list route, which you've already seen up here. Whoops. So that's basically going to end up calling this route right here, which will then re-render that page with the users' email addresses. And of course, now there's one additional one. So those are routes. So the way that you can invoke these routes, first of all, we have to start the server. So we can start the server with npm start. Now, going back for a moment, npm start is actually calling this script. So it's saying, okay, it's actually executing a command node. Remember, that's a command line interpreter. From the book, you can just write node and it will give you a command line interpreter for JavaScript. But in this case, we want the command line interpreter to execute this particular file. So while I actually am going to type npm start, what's actually getting executed is this www file right here. And that's where it gets nasty, and it's why you're using Express. So for example, it's setting the port that you are listening on. It's creating a server, and it's listening on the port and doing some stuff with errors and on listening events. Okay, and you can see this is just stuff you don't want to have to deal with. And it's just, so we're not going to, it's just showing you that there's a lot going on under the hood, so to speak. And this was all generated essentially when you created the Express project for this particular interface. So we're just going to type npm start, and now the server is running. And it's running locally right now on my machine, but I can now type different routes. So we will actually, let's see. Okay. So if you look here, you can see localhost 3000 / user list. So that's the route. So we're listening on port 3000. I think you saw the port was set to 3000. And we are using the route / user list. So that called that route and it rendered this particular user list. Okay, if I want a new user, I'll instead use the new user route. Of course, you can see there's not any styling here, but you could add CSS styling, or again, there are a whole bunch of CSS preprocessors. So we'll add a new one, Tom the Cat, in honor of the new Tom and Jerry movie. And it's tom@warnerbrothers.com. When we hit submit, don't want RoboForm. There we go. It added Tom the Cat. And I could now send email to Tom the Cat. Okay, so very simple example to show you kind of what's going on with Node.js. And I did not do, notice here, it's just running the command line right now. So basically the server just running at the command line, I can kill it with Control-C. There is stuff that you need to do to set it up. There's a lot of so-called middleware that is being used to handle a lot of the ugliness of Node.js. So you can see we required monk. This is where we got that database variable. Remember in the routes request.db, well, that's where we called monk, and we were connecting on that port with node test 1. And we had to actually make, it didn't magically become available to the request object. We actually had to add this to the request object. And I'm not going to go into details, but basically we're just setting up a whole bunch of middleware in this app.js file that's created for us by Express, and adding some things. And this next just calls the next function that is adding certain things to the request object. You can see up here, the views was set to the views directory. We set the engine to EJS. We could have set it to Pug or some other engine instead. You can see here that anytime we use the slash route, it's going to call something called index router. And if we look at index router, we can see that index router is associated with routes/index. Remember, index.js was the file that we were using with our routes. Okay, if instead we had routes that started with /users, then that would be defined in the users.js file. And down here, we associate any route that starts with /users and tell it to look at users router to find those server functions. Okay, so I'm not, again, not going to go through all this middleware stuff that's going on. The tutorial does a fabulous job, in my opinion, of doing that for you. So it's the best tutorial I've found. It was one recommended by the book, but literally, I think it takes about an hour to really get everything installed and upload it and working. You got to download some things like a MongoDB package. You need to download node.js, but it seems to work pretty seamlessly, except on Linux. Linux boxes seem to have a lot of trouble with node.js. So I can't, if you try to do it on a Linux box, I can't give you a lot of help on that. If you do it on a Windows or Mac box on your time and run into some trouble, I'm happy to help you with it. Okay, so you can go and you can read a lot of articles and look at what is people think about Node.js versus PHP. So basically, if you're looking at the pros and the cons, in general, Node.js is faster. It's not as heavyweight. So that's partly because of just-in-time compilation. It's partly because of lightweight threads. And it's asynchronous. So basically a whole bunch of stuff can be going on simultaneously. You can have a whole bunch of different client requests that are constantly being handled. I see a lot of different estimates of how many connections you can handle on a single server. I've seen anywhere from 10K up to 1 million, and I really not sure where people get that. At any rate, it can handle a considerable number of user connections at one time. Of course, it's assuming that I think you don't have them all functioning at the same time, because I don't see how you could possibly have 1 million people hammering a database on a single server. So I would tend to be more believing of this number as far as connections that can be handled at a single time. And it works well with single servers, but it does scale up to clusters. So PHP, on the other hand, is its advantage is that it can do a lot of computation. On the server side, without impeding other clients. So PHP does well basically with heavy computation. Node.js does well when essentially you're just hitting the database and not doing a lot of other computation. So I'd say Node.js is good for DB intensive GUIs. And PHP is good for computation intensive. Now, it turns out everyone borrows from everyone else. So a big thing initially about Node.js was its just-in-time compilation. Well, the PHP folks took that to heart and basically have sped it up using just-in-time compilation. So PHP isn't as slow as it used to be because it uses many versions now also use just-in-time compilation. As far as the code base, so PHP currently has many more projects. But my sense is that Node.js has the lion's share of new projects. It appears that PHP, the number of projects implemented in PHP outnumber Node.js by a significant number. I think perhaps even more than 10 to 1. But Node.js is catching up because it seems that more, as I say, of the recent projects are being implemented in Node.js, and there's a very active development community for Node.js. There's over 1 million modules. That's amazing. That just dwarfs anything that's available for PHP or Python or Perl. So there's just a huge number of modules. So that has its pros and cons because not everyone is going to maintain their modules. So if you're relying on a module and then it's not maintained, it may have security issues. But on the other hand, you may well have a module that's well tailored to whatever it is you want to be doing. So it's, and then people talk about, well, you only have to use JavaScript, you don't have to use PHP, but if you dig into Node.js, you have to learn a bunch of syntax anyhow. Like you have to learn the syntax associated with whatever view template engine you're using, like Pug or EJS. And if you look at the books, Zybook, so if we look at, let's look at Pug for a moment. So the point, supposedly, of using Node.js is you don't have to learn a new language. You just learn JavaScript, and that's all you need. Well, except you have to render, so you're going to have to learn Pug syntax if you're using Pug. And then Pug decided, hey, why don't we develop our own, where is it? It has its own syntax for loops. I'm trying to find them. There we go. Pug decided, hey, why don't we set up our own if and unless condition and our own loop syntax and our own while loop. And so it's like the whole point of initially using Node.js was you didn't have to learn another language, but then these template engines go and they introduce their own language syntax. So it kind of is like, okay, I know I'm old school, so I like using PHP. I think it's simple. It's not hard to learn. It looks like C. I get that Node.js is faster and lighter weight. And it works well with so-called single page applications. And I get that actually it probably would work really well with your ABET project that you're doing, because your ABET project is essentially a single page application. Once you get past the login page, it's basically you're working on that one ABET page. So the other thing associated with Node.js, you often talk about single page applications. So all the resources are loaded once and they're associated with a single page, and then you simply, instead of constantly recomputing a new page, which is what PHP does, you simply update that single page. So for example, I told you earlier, my recommendation when you select a new outcome is to completely recompute this page, which is computationally burdensome and takes up time on the server side. Okay, so I wasn't actually having you do it in the traditional way of a single page application. A single page application would say, hey, these widgets are already here. So when you select a new outcome, we'll leave the widgets and just update them with new values. And the same thing with the narrative summary. Hey, these widgets are already there. It's a big waste of time on the server side to construct the HTML associated with them. Just take whatever comes back from the database and fill in these 3 form elements. Now, this is a little different because here you're going to have to basically toss, you may have to figure out how many rows you need. So if the previous one had 4 rows and the new outcome has only 2 rows, you'd have to go in and delete 2 rows and then you could fill in the form. So it does allow you to reuse existing HTML, maybe at the cost of more coding because you have to do more manipulation with the DOM, whereas with PHP, you basically just say, okay, here's a view template. We're going to recreate it from scratch, and that's simpler. Okay, so if I did a full database and scripting languages, or I'm sorry, a full scripting languages course, then I would have spent half a semester also teaching you Node.js because I think it's important. But what dictates why I teach PHP still is because it's still the case that PHP has many more projects, and you're more likely to end up on some project with legacy PHP code where you have to do a lot of PHP fiddling. You're less likely to end up on some new project that's using Node.js. Hence, given that I had 7 weeks to devote to one or the other, I devoted it to the PHP backend because I think it's more generally useful. Okay, so with that, I am going to let you go. I hope you enjoyed the semester. And for those of you graduating, I wish you the best of luck in getting jobs or moving on into graduate school. For those of you who aren't graduating, good luck going forward with your classes in the fall. And as I said, I will be available right now for a few minutes. Then again, just going back here, for a few minutes during office hours, but only up to 2:50. Then tonight, I'll try to get on sometime between 8:30 and 9:30 for about an hour, and I'll make an announcement. And then tomorrow, I'm also going to hold office hours from 11 to 12. So I will see y'all later, and you are free to go.